Welcome, everyone, to this next session. Hello, my name is Nessa Kenny, and I manage Innovations for Poverty Action's Peace and Recovery Program and our Humanitarian and Forced Displacement Initiative. IPA is lucky enough to have supported much of the great work being presented at this conference through research funding from the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. It's my pleasure to moderate this academic panel today, where we'll be delving into findings from some of the latest research on refugee return. I think this panel dovetails nicely with the discussion in the previous session. We of course need tools and methods to help track and understand highly mobile populations. And I think hopefully these new tools and methods can help us better understand populations that return to their country of origin as well. So issues around whether, how, and why returnees make those decisions to return and what the impacts of that return is. In this session, we're really lucky to have 3 papers focused on this from presenters who are deeply immersed in these topics. Daniel Masterson, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, will present his work on the dynamics of return of Syrian refugees to Lebanon. Dany Bahar, Associate Professor at Brown University, will present his paper on the impacts of returning refugees on export performance in former Yugoslavia. And finally, Isabel Ruiz, Fellow in Economics at the University of Oxford, will present her work on refugee return and social cohesion in Burundi. Before we begin, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Each panelist will have 20 to 25 minutes to present their paper, followed by 5 to 10 minutes of discussions. I'll be keeping time throughout and will provide reminders to the presenters when they have 10 minutes and 5 minutes left. If you'd like to ask a question, I would encourage you to please submit them through the chat, either in WebEx or on the YouTube live stream. Alternatively, if you're participating via WebEx, you can raise your hand to be unmuted. Finally, as with other sessions at this conference, this panel is being recorded. So without further ado, I'll invite Dan Masterson, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, to kick us off. Dan, go ahead.
Hello. Hi. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Nessa. Does everything look okay? Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
We can hear you.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Well, so thank you everybody for attending. I'm really excited to share this work with you. This is joint work with Ala El-Robeba, who is a postdoc at ETH Zurich, and Marine Casalis, who is a program manager at ETH Zurich, Dominic Hangartner, who is a professor at ETH Zurich, and Jeremy Weinstein, who's a professor at Stanford University. And we all are affiliated or have been affiliated in different ways with the Immigration Policy Lab, which is jointly based at Stanford University and ETH Zurich. And like Nessa kindly said, I'm currently based at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So the question that we look at in this project is overall, how do refugee crises end? And a fundamental part of any answer to this question of how refugee crises end involves the long-term prospects of people who have been forcibly displaced and when people can return. And the reality is that few people who have been forcibly displaced have opportunities for 2 of the 3 durable solutions, namely local integration and third country resettlement. And so, the truth is just a very small share of people have the opportunity for local integration or third country resettlement, which means that most people living as refugees face a choice between either continued displacement, either in the country where they are at present or moving to some other country, or return. And so, this question is framed around this fact that the vast majority of people living as refugees face this challenge of between continued displacement and return. And it's critical to understand who returns and who doesn't. And so, I don't need to convince this audience of the importance of this major policy challenge around refugee return and planning for return. And it's in many large-scale refugee crises and situations of prolonged displacement, the prospect of return has the potential for major impacts on economics, politics, and security. First and foremost for the refugees themselves, but also for hosting countries of origin, and important implications for the policy community. And so, the question that we want to understand or provide evidence to in this project is who decides to return home, when do they plan to return home, and why? What are the drivers of those decisions? And so the evidence that I'll be presenting today is drawn from representative survey data on return intentions uh, and its drivers based on observational survey data and experimental conjoint analysis from surveys done with Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And so just to dive right in, I want to briefly present the theoretical framework that we use to approach this question, and then move on quickly to our evidence, which we don't have a lot of time today. So, we generally think about the factors that might be shaping refugees' choices about whether to return to their home country or not in three general bins. And these are sort of categories of thinking about the predictors of migration that come from a large body of work on the topic. And so, first, sort of the general class of predictors of migration, and in this case, return migration that we think about, are what are called pull factors. So this situation would refer to sort of the complex range of factors that people consider as they're living as refugees in Lebanon when they look back home to Syria. So the situation and the conditions in Syria that shape people's decisions about migration, return migration. And so in this case, this would include wartime violence, people's experiences of violence in Syria, the prospect of violence in the future, post-war violence. This is something you might think of Stephanie Schwartz's work that we see as a regularity in post-war situations, in post-return situations. There is the prospect of further violence. People might think about their economic prospects in Syria, and people might think about the political threats, arrest, retribution, torture. So this is the sort of the range of what we call pull factors that we think about in this project. And the second bin of factors is referred to as pull or push factors. So these are the conditions in Lebanon that might be shaping people's thinking about return. So many refugee hosting countries, Lebanon included, even those that are initially receptive to refugee migration, often gradually ramp up anti-refugee rhetoric and undercut refugees' legal residency and right to work, often from a logic that making conditions harder for refugees in the hosting country will push them to leave, move on, go back to their hosting country. So, there is generally a political narrative that undergirds this belief that push factors will matter. So we want to explore that as well in this project. And then third, we think about mobility costs and information. So in terms of mobility costs, households, when they're thinking about whether to return to their home country, need to weigh the financial costs and the physical risks associated with moving. These costs and risks are likely to vary depending on one's destination and the household characteristics and like family size. And then in terms of information, there's a real challenge for a household or an individual thinking about returning to their home country in trying to evaluate the costs and benefits of return. Because people might have fairly accurate information about what the conditions are in the hosting country, but beliefs about the conditions in their home country and in their place of origin are often only a guess based on limited information that they have from various sources that they try to aggregate and compare to reconcile conflicting information. So we also want to look at the role of information in people's return choices. So let's move on to what we did, and I want to tell you a little bit about the data and then move on to the results. So we collected a nationally representative survey of just over 3,000 Syrian refugee heads of household in Lebanon. And this data collection took place in August to October 2019. And so it's important to note that this survey, ending in October 29, took place before the widespread protest movement in Lebanon, before the economic crisis, before COVID-19. So the last 2 years since this survey took place have really been extremely dynamic and and difficult time for people in Lebanon, Syrians and Lebanese, both. And so what we did for data collection was there was a first stage where we drew a stratified sample of towns, stratified according to the prevalence of the Syrian population relative to the total population in the town, and also stratifying along majority Lebanese sect. So Lebanon as a consociational democracy, sect plays an important role in politics. And then second, without a full listing of the households within these towns, we conducted a random walk within each of the localities that was selected in the first stage. And then in the survey, we measured household characteristics that we thought might be predictors of return, things that I talked about in the theory slide just before. We asked people about their return intentions, and we conducted a conjoint experiment, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. Okay, so let's move on to the findings from the survey. And so, the first thing that we are interested in is in people's return intentions. So let's take a look at the descriptive statistics of what people reported as their return intentions in late 2019. So we asked people if they intended to return to Syria within 1 year. So this would have been approximately by the end of 2020. And so approaching the end of 2019, about 5% of people in our sample said that they intended to return within a 1 year time period. When we zoomed that out to a 2 year time period, meaning approaching the end of 2021, approaching where we are today, we saw that about a quarter of the people in our sample reported that they intended to return. And again, I think that it's important to note that this was before the economic crisis, before the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I think another really interesting outcome is we asked people if they ever want to return. At any point in their life, do they plan to return to Syria? And we found that about 2/3 of people in this sample reported that they plan to return to Syria at some point in the future. And I mean, this is really striking just on its own. If we think about the magnitude of roughly a million plus Syrians in Lebanon, and a third of them report that they do not plan to ever return to Syria. I mean, this is really a sizable share of the population that does not, as of the end of 2019, did not see a future for themselves and their families in Syria. So now let's move on to looking at the predictors of people's return intentions and predictors of steps that people took to prepare to return to Syria. And so the first step that we do for this is analysis of the observational data that we drew from the survey of people's living conditions in their place of origin in Syria, and their reported return intentions and reported preparations to return to Syria. And so we wanted to measure those general classes of factors that I talked about in that theory slide: pull factors, push factors, mobility costs, and information. And for each of these bins, we broke them up into more precise factors. So for the pull factors, we wanted to look at the role of physical safety in people's hometown, Syria, the effect of control of people's hometown, which actors controlled the hometown. Third, economic prospects in people's hometown. Fourth, the availability of services. And then fifth, people's personal networks in Syria. And so for each of these factors, as we did for the factors on the next slides that I'll talk about, we took a wide range of survey questions about, say, physical safety in someone's hometown, and we calculated an index which takes the core information from multiple, for people who aren't familiar with principal component analysis and index construction from data, it took sort of the core information from multiple variables and reduced it down to a single variable. So we have a single variable that captures core variation in the physical safety in people's hometown, and a separate single variable that captures the critical variation in the control of people's hometown in Syria. And then third, another index that captures critical variation in the economic prospects in people's hometown, et cetera. So we did the same thing to look at push factors in Lebanon. So for push factors in Lebanon, we calculated indices to measure people's economic well-being in Lebanon. 2, an index to measure people's access to services, electricity, water, schools, hospitals in Lebanon. 3rd, people's personal networks in Lebanon. 4th, people's social well-being, their networks, their integration socially in Lebanon. And then 5th, their legal status in Lebanon, residency, registration with UNHCR. And then last, to measure mobility costs, this prospect of the mobility cost if people were to return to Syria. We looked at metrics based on travel distance and household size. The idea that in general, longer trips are more costly and larger households are more costly to move back to Syria. And then last, just try and get at the importance of confidence in information about conditions back home. We asked people a battery of questions about their confidence in the information they have about the situation in Syria and their ability to access information about a range of factors like security, the availability of public services, etc. Okay, so let's take a minute. I want to step back for people that aren't experienced in reading sort of busy coefficient plots like this, just to walk the audience through this plot so that everybody is clear about what this plot is representing. Okay, so on the left-hand side of this plot, you'll see labels representing the predictors of return that we want to study the role of. So you'll see each of those pull factors in Syria, the role of safety, regime control, economic well-being, etc., all the way down to confidence in information. And on the top, you'll see 2 outcomes. So first, there's a binary outcome of whether someone reported that they intended to return to Syria in 12 months. And second, there is preparations to return. Okay, so this is an index that is reducing all of the possible steps that we ask people about in terms of preparations to return to Syria into a single index variable. And each of the dots in this plot, again, to introduce people to what this is representing, each of these dots represents the relationship between the outcome up top and the push or pull factor on the left. And what this is showing us is, based on our data, the expected change in the outcome if the push or pull factor increased by 1 standard deviation. And so the circle and triangle represent 2 different models. The triangle represents each index alone with a range of covariates, and the circle represents a model with all the indices together in a sort of horse race style model. Okay, so after that, so that brief introduction, let me walk us through briefly what we see here. Okay, so if you look at the top left, if you look at the role of pull factors in predicting people's 12-month return intentions, we see fairly consistent evidence of an increase in return intentions among people who had better prospects in terms of safety, economic well-being, the availability of services, and personal networks in their place of origin in Syria. If you shift down and look at the role of push factors in Lebanon, we see something that's surprising. We might expect that people who are better off in Lebanon, people who have better economic well-being, better access to services, and stronger networks in Lebanon would be less likely to intend to return within 12 months. But in fact, we don't see clear evidence of that. And this is when we move to preparations that people have taken to return. The evidence isn't as strong as it is for intentions to return, but we see first off that for some of the pull factors in Syria, among people who had better prospects in Syria, they were more likely to take preparations to return. And similarly with push factors in Lebanon, among people who were better off in Lebanon, we don't see that they were less likely to prepare to return. If anything, we can see for some of these results, economic well-being, networks, and social well-being to a much lesser extent. It seems like people who are better off in Lebanon were actually more likely to take steps to return to Syria. And then lastly, looking down at the results for mobility cost and information are not as strong. It does look like there is some evidence that people with higher confidence in information are more likely to intend to return. But I want to move forward, since we're short on time, and look at the results from the conjoint experiment. And these are the last set of results that we'll be talking about today. And so, to those that aren't familiar, a conjoint experiment is, in this instance, the situation where you give people a hypothetical scenario about conditions in Syria, and you randomly vary the details of that hypothetical scenario. So we randomly varied the security situation, the economic prospects, the availability of services, and randomly varied conditions in Lebanon in this hypothetical scenario about the future. And then we asked them, in this hypothetical scenario, would you return to Syria or not? So the downside of this is that it's hypothetical. The upside is that it allows us to randomly vary these conditions that you can't randomly vary in the real world, and therefore get at the causal effect of variation in these conditions on people's intentions to return in its hypothetical setup. So just to give a quick example of what one of these would look like, and the parts that are randomly varied are in bold text. So the numerator would read to a respondent, imagine that 1 year from now, all of Syria is quite safe. It appears that, in your hometown, there are many job opportunities. As for conscription, military conscription is still in place. In Lebanon, health centers and schools are available and affordable. Finally, regarding your friends and relatives, most of them are in Syria. Under these conditions, would you return to Syria? And so what we find from this experimental setup in terms of the predictors of people's return intentions is really striking, both in the extent to which it is consistent with the observational results, but also just how strongly predictive pull factors in Syria are relative to push factors. So, first off, we see that safety in Syria is far and away the most important predictor. Having someone's hometown be safe or all of Syria be safe relative to saying that their hometown is not safe leads to an almost 40 percentage point increase in people's probability of saying that they would return in this hypothetical scenario. And then looking at jobs in Syria, public services in Syria, we see about a 10 percentage point increase. And for military conscription, we see about a 20 percentage point increase in people's return intentions. So looking now below at jobs in Lebanon and public services in Lebanon, we see here that we are able to detect effects of people having a good job in Lebanon or being able to access public services in Lebanon on people's return intentions, unlike the observational analysis. But the effect sizes are very small. So even though these effects are detectable in the conjoint, we can see that having a good job in Lebanon only decreases somebody's probability of saying that they would return by a couple percentage points, 2 or 3 percentage points. Similarly with being able to access public services in Lebanon. And then last, we see that if people have family and friends in Lebanon, this does not change their reported intentions to return. If they have family and friends in Syria, it increases their intentions to return by about 5 percentage points. So overall, we see that the most important predictors in this conjoint are conditions in Syria, which aligns with what we saw in the observational data analysis. Okay, so let's see. So just to close up, wrap up, take a minute to reflect on the results. So we saw that relatively few Syrians at the end of 2019 reported that they planned to return by October 2020, just about 5%, but most, 2/3, said that they wanted to return eventually at some point in their life. But 2/3, still, 1/3 of 1 million plus people is really a very large share of people that don't see a future for themselves and their family in Syria. And then last, looking sort of together at the observational analysis and the conjoint experiment, see the most important predictors of people's return intentions are safety conditions in Syria. Second, economic conditions and public services in their place of origin. And then sort of a big drop in terms of the predictive power of factors to networks and family and friends. And then last, conditions in Lebanon, which surprisingly played the smallest role of all the factors that we measured. And so, I mean, a couple of reflections just to wrap up is, I mean, I see this as really reaffirming the fundamental humanitarian mandate of the refugee protection regime. That, you know, when people are thinking about whether to continue living in a second country as a refugee or return to their home country, they look to threats and safety in their home country. Their decision is driven by safety conditions in Syria, not by economic opportunity in Lebanon. And this also suggests the possibility that the policy framework that sort of unwelcoming hosting states often use in making life hard for refugees with this sort of this informal theory in their head that if life is hard for refugees, they'll be more likely to return, is ultimately misguided. And that making life harder for refugees may in fact not make them more likely to return to their home country. And so what this suggests is that supporting refugees in a hosting country will simply improve people's well-being, but will not change their return intentions. While in contrast, making life difficult for refugees in the hosting country will simply increase immiseration, but will not make them more likely to return. And in contrast, improving conditions in people's place of origin may be the key to increasing return. And last, I think there's the possibility for more information, thinking about the role of information. And we saw small but consistent effects for the fact that information may increase, that credible information may increase people's return intentions. Okay, so with that, I will end my screen share. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dan. That was a great presentation and such an important piece of research. One initial clarification question from Isabel about the vignettes that were presented. Were they presented as a prompt and were the bolded parts in bold? And how many of those vignettes were presented per respondent?
So the vignettes were read to the respondents. So I mean, the sort of the range of people who were surveyed was really quite diverse in a number of factors, you know, including socioeconomic status and past educational history. So not just so some of the survey respondents were you know, sort of low literacy, and so to make sure that this was delivered to everyone in the same way, the enumerators read the hypothetical scenario to respondents, and I believe it was three iterations of the hypothetical scenario for each person. So they were introduced, you know, that they will be read, you know, three different hypothetical scenarios. And yeah, so that was presented, varied 3 times to each respondent.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think from a practice perspective, 2 things really stick out at me that are particularly interesting from this paper. I think the first is the point that you made towards the end about how this, in this case, forced displacement is not a cover for economic migration, given the fact that the vast majority of refugees do intend to return to Syria when conditions improve. And I think you spoke a little bit about the policy implications of that, but I think that was really interesting. And I think the second is the use of sort of rationalist models of household decision making about return from displacement is interesting. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to how you and the team think about using those when studying a population whose decisions are necessarily influenced by violence or conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, this is ultimately, you know, an empirical project. We draw on a lot of other work that has developed these theories about individual or household decision making. And I mean, the way that we try to bridge those is, you know, we in the survey ask questions about individual intentions, about household intentions, about the conditions for individuals and for the households. And I think one thing that we can't speak to just with this intentions data, but I hope that future research that looks at sort of return behavior, not just return intentions, is going to be able to explore is when individuals return versus when full households return, when households end up doing sort of a split return where some members return, but some stay in the hosting country. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of complexity there that still needs to be explored.
Great, thank you very much. I realize, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get through all the questions in the chat, but perhaps the presenters would be so kind as to answer some by text if possible. With that, thank you very much, Dan. We're going to move on to Dany. Dany Bahar is an associate professor at Brown University, and he will be talking to us about his work about returnees to the former Yugoslavia. Dany, whenever you're ready. There seems to be some kind of, oh, there we are. Dany, go ahead. I think you might be on mute. We still can't hear you, unfortunately.
Now, Carl, you can, right?
We can, yes.
Sorry about that. All right. I'm an immigrant, but immigrants on average are much more better than me in doing things. So, and that's what I'm going to talk about. All right. Thank you so much for allowing me to present. And, you know, it's really great to be among so many people whose work I admire and I follow closely. And this is a paper that actually been working for a while. You know, I must say that it has been accepted already for publication. That doesn't mean that I'm sure you will have great comments, and we definitely will you know, will inform also this work with the future. But I thought it was important to put that out there. And I mean, we just talked about the likelihood a little bit of when refugees want to come back, and now I'm going to tell you what happens when they actually come back and how important that flow is in the reconstruction of a place in particular that went through war. So I think it's very relevant for what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Venezuela and other countries. And this is the case of Yugoslavian returning refugees in the 1990s. And this is joint work with my co-authors here on the screen. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the context. I mean, all of this you already know about the importance of refugees and the fact that we have little evidence on refugees returning. And this paper in particular is really looking at how migrants, refugees in this case, really can play a role in shaping the economic structure of their home countries when they return. And again, looking at the case of Yugoslavian refugees in the 1990s. So what we do in this paper is that we actually exploit an actual experiment of Yugoslavian refugees who were hosted by Germany for a few years temporarily, and we're going to be using social security data of these refugees while in Germany. Or, you know, simply put, our question asks, can returning refugees, after having worked abroad in a specific sector, explain better export performance of the same sector at home when they return? And essentially here we're trying to get to the idea that, you know, when these refugees were integrated into those economies, which is of course important policy implication, they were exposed to better technology, better knowledge, better best practices, and we are asking to what extent they were actually able to bring those back, and how does that reflect into higher exports, which is the main variable we're looking at here. But we're also looking at some productivity outcomes. And basically our main result is, the answer is yes. Between 1990 and 2005, we find that Yugoslavian industries that had 10% more returnees exhibit a larger exports by 0.8 to 1.6%. So these are elasticities. But for you to have a sense of actually what this means in practice is that in our sample, the returning refugees explain up to 6% of all the export growth in former Yugoslavia during 1990 to 2005, and you know, our sample is it's a representative sample, but it's a very small one. So if you actually think that this number was much higher, they can actually explain a big portion. And this is a paper in which we went, we were very obsessed with the causal, to trying to make a causal inference, and we have an IV strategy that will or main identification strategy, an IV strategy that uses exogenous allocation rules for asylum seekers in Germany. Asylum seekers in this context are a subset of all the refugees, and I'm gonna explain that better. I'm not gonna talk too much about the different tests for the mechanisms because of time, but I'll just give you the punchline. All results we claim, and we feel very strongly about it, are consistent with industry level productivity shifts, responding to returning refugees, bringing that know-how, and we're able to rule out a bunch of different things that could also explain those results, like structural transformation convergence, scale issues, like you have more migrants coming back, so automatically you get a bigger industry, bilateral trade costs through networks. That's not something we see here. Or the ability of immigrants to bring capital, and that expands industries. Those are not the mechanisms that we're seeing here. We're really we have a lot of evidence to show that this is a productivity increase. And as part of that, I am going to show you a couple of, hopefully towards the end, some results showing that particularly the people who drive our results. I mean, these Yugoslavian refugees that are the ones driving our results are people in particular occupations, which we describe as those more apt to transfer knowledge, technologies, and best practices. So these are skilled, professionals, people performing analytical and cognitive tasks, people in supervisory roles, people who are working for the highest paying firms, and people who actually experience very fast wage growth, meaning that they actually learned a lot while they were in Germany. I'm going to skip a little bit the contribution because we all know the literature well, and for the sake of time, I want to try to get to the results. So the background for our study is Yugoslavia, this country that existed in until the early 1990s. In 1991, Yugoslavia starts a process that ends with its disintegration into 6 countries and 7 later on when Kosovo also secedes. This doesn't make justice to all the story, but in a punchline, Croatia and Slovenia are the first countries that decide to secede from Yugoslavia, and there's the fighting begins right away. But the fighting really escalates in 1992 when Bosnia votes for independence, and that really leads to a very bloody and disastrous ethnic war between Muslims and Serbs and Croats around the territory. That was also fueled by the armed forces of the different nations involved. As in any other war, this resulted in a massive force displacement, the largest force displacement actually since World War II at the time. And this all ends on paper, at least in 1995, with the signature of the Dayton Accords that marked the end to the war. We're talking about 3.7 million people, who were 16% of the population, who actually had to flee their homes, that were forcibly displaced. From those, about 800,000 left to foreign countries. And the most common destination for those who left to a foreign country was Germany, that accepted about 600,000 Yugoslavian refugees. So at the time, the German authorities decided to create a new category in terms of visas for this population. That's something that happens often, like not always like people who we would think are refugees are actually recognized as refugees. Same thing for Venezuelans in Colombia. They have a special visa. They're not formally recognized as refugees. The Germans at the time created something called a Duldung status. I'm sure there's some German speakers in the room, so correct me if I'm wrong, but Duldung means toleration. So it was essentially a visa that allowed people to work in the labor force with no restrictions, but it lasted for 6 months, but it was renewed every 6 months almost automatically as long as the war was going on. So it was it means toleration because it was essentially a suspended deportation status. So as long as you had the Duldung, you were not going to be deported. You had a right to be there as long as it was safe, or as long as it was not safe to go back. There's a small share of people, which we're going to use for empirical purposes, that opted for actually requesting asylum or refugee status. This was a costly process. You know, they have to go through, as some of you know, through like individual interviews. They have to show that they have been persecuted and so on. But there were some people that thought that that was a better way for them to stay in the country in the long run. So some people actually requested asylum. If they were denied, they also could have the chance to ask for the duldum. So you're going to have a lot of people who requested asylum, perhaps were denied and went on for the duldum status. And these actually we're going to use for our IV strategy. Hopefully I'll get to explain that in theory. Otherwise, you'll have to believe me, it's well identified. But anyway, what happens in 1995? The Dayton Accords were signed, officially marking the end of the war. And at that point, the German authorities had really no reason to further renew the duldum status. That was kind of the deal to begin with. And they actually start with an enforced repatriation for duldum holders that the status expired. So just for you to have an idea, between 1996 and 2000, more than 75% of these migrants or Yugoslavian refugees were repatriated back to former Yugoslavian countries. Our data, when we look at social security data, we don't see these huge rates, but we still see a significant rate of return in the way that we measure return, which is not perfect, but it gets us a great deal to that place. This is how our data looks at this, by the way. You know, these are all the workers, Yugoslavian workers that come into Germany year by year. The bars here are the net inflow. So you know, you start seeing that there's a lot of Yugoslavian workers entering the labor force in Germany very significantly in the early 1990s. The line here is the stock. So of course, when the net inflows are positive, the stock is going down. It's going up, I'm sorry. And then after 1995, when, according to the story I just told you, we see it in the data, there is a net outflow of Yugoslavian workers from the labor force. And then really the levels of Yugoslavian population in Germany goes down almost. It doesn't go all the way to converge to what it was before, but it goes down pretty dramatically. These points that you see here are the asylum requests. So there is, of course, an increase in asylum requests in the early 1990s, and then it goes down almost to the level to zero. But again, and it's a significant amount. It's not tiny, but it's about half of the people who are actually entering who request for asylum. Just a word on the data. We're using basically administrative data, essentially from the Social Security of Germany. This is confidential data. It's from the Institute of Employment Research, and it covers 80% of the workforce. We have a random sample of 40% of foreign nationals every year, and actually we expand that by following over time any individual who is sampled at least once. So our sample actually is quite representative, we believe. And we focus on tradable industries, and you know, the workers in tradable industries in Germany results in a representative sample of workers that is about 20,000 workers, as I said before. And our main source of the left-hand side variable, even though I'm going to change it quite a bit, is just simply publicly available export data. So we're looking really at all the exports from the Yugoslavian countries to the rest of the world, using you know, UN Comtrade data, and using 4-digit industries. So we have about 700 or 800 industries, tradable industries, of course. One thing we do, and I mean I can talk about that offline if you guys want, but we don't have, because of the data that only exists for Yugoslavia for 1991 and then exists for all the different countries later, we actually create, you know, we treat Yugoslavia or the Yugoslavian nations as one country as a whole before and after. So we aggregate all the exports from Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, etc., into one unit after 1991, and we're looking at Yugoslavia as a whole before and after. I'm talking about before and after, so you probably should have foreseen that I'm going to talk about a diff and diff, which is our very, very main simple specification. There's nothing fancy here. Basically, what we're doing, I mean, our main results are going to look at, you know, each observation or sample is going to be one product and a period. So we have the before and after. And what we're going to look at is the exports from Yugoslavia to the rest of the world. And we actually exclude Germany just to make sure that it's not a bilateral trade story, even though we do more on that. And then simply we have a diff and diff, where the treatment is the number of the Yugoslavian refugees that work in each industry in Germany that basically we categorize as Duldung holders. So these are people who appeared in the German labor force between 91 and 95, basically who came because of the war, and that had left by 2000. Essentially, they were repatriated because the Duldung status had expired. The before period is before the war, 1990, and after period is about 15 years later in 2005, just to give some time for this to kick in. These are treatment works. I'm just gonna skip this for the sake of time. If I want you to remember something from this talk, it's gonna be this figure. I'm gonna show you with raw data. There's nothing here. There's no fixed effects. There's no regression. There's nothing. I always like to show at least raw data and see if at least there's a correlation there. So I'm going to show you basically the exports from Yugoslavia to the rest of the world across time, but I'm going to divide them in 4 groups, and the 4 groups correspond to the 4 quartiles of the treatment. So the first quartile are the industries in which there was very few, almost non-Yugoslavian workers in Germany during that period of time. Quartile 2 is, the next quartile, also very few workers. And then you start seeing a little bit more workers, and then quartile 4 are the industries that actually had many, many more workers in Yugoslavian workers in Germany during that time. And this graph, I like it because it has a couple of things. First of all, before 1995, roughly, I'm not saying that this is a rigorous test, but roughly you see that the trends are quite parallel. But then afterwards, you do see a big divergence based on the treatment. And this is what I'm going to show you with a diff and diff and with all the controls and the ID, etc. Identification is a big deal on this paper, and it's really going to take me, I have only 10 minutes, it's going to take me a long while to get through it. So I am going to kind of give you roughly the idea. There are 2 main threats of identification that we think are the most important ones, and they all have to do with self-selection, right? The first one is self-selection into export sectors, meaning I'm a Yugoslavian worker, I arrived to Germany in 1992. This is a little bit of a long shot, but we're economists, we have to think about everything. And I think, maybe in 2000, the Yugoslavian car industry is gonna really start shooting. So maybe I wanna work in cars in Germany while I'm here so that I'll have the experience. That is a source of possible endogeneity that we look at. The second one is self-selection and exit, meaning like when the Duldung status expires, it's already the year 2000, 1998, and I'm being forced. I mean, this repatriation was quite enforced. But let's say, like, if I saw that there was a future for me and my occupation in Yugoslavia, I might have been more likely to actually collaborate with authorities to go back. So we deal with the 2 of them. And the first one, what we do essentially is that here's where we use the asylum seekers. So the story of asylum seekers, if you were an asylum seeker, which is a subset of all the refugees at that time, you were exogenously sent to a different state of Germany, a different province or state of Germany, based on the coin. My German is very bad, but in the Coinsteiner key. So it was an agreement between the states of Germany on how to divide the burden in terms of asylum seekers, which had to do, each state will get more or less asylum seekers based on their tax revenues and their population at the time of their arrival. So based on that, and based on the baseline distribution of industries in each state, we kind of come up with a distribution like asylum seekers should be working in these industries. So based on that, that's our first stage to actually say something about what is the actual distribution, to explain the actual distribution of workers, of Yugoslavian workers in German industries, based on what we think is a very decently well exogenous allocation. So here's an example. Like, if I'm a person who asks for asylum seeker and I'm sent to Bavaria, and I end up in Munich, and 90% of Munich industries is cars, very likely I'm going to end up working in cars, right? So I'm using that exogenous, what we call an exogenous rule, to say something about the actual distribution of refugees in industries. We can talk about it, whether this is exogenous or not, and we think a lot about that, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. The second one, the second thread is exogenous exit, like meaning are people actually deciding to go more likely to collaborate with enforcement to go back if they are in an industry in which there's a future for it. And here what we do is to show you basically that essentially the same people, the same share of Yugoslavian workers who entered industry, the car industry, is the same share that left. So the entry and exit are pretty much aligned in the 45-degree line. Is not completely random, but you know, the correlation is 0.88. So we don't see like huge disparities on certain industries in which people really decided to stay more than the people that decided to go in. I probably have a few minutes left, so I'm glad I got to the results. It doesn't always happen. So these are the main results. It's a very simple diff and diff. The OLS is on the left-hand side, the 2 SLS on the right-hand side. These were the numbers I told you at the beginning come from. This is all in as in H, the asymptotic inverse hyperbolic sign. So these can be interpreted as elasticities because these are large numbers. So basically, this is the number that said at the beginning that the industries that had 10% more returning refugees will experience an increase, or we will end up having exports that are 9 to 16% higher 15 years later. And again, here we have exports in logs export plus 1 in the inverse hyperbolic sign. So you choose whichever you want. But this is basically our main result. This, when we do this in an event study kind of thing, and I'm showing this because I think there's an interesting pattern. So basically here, I'm showing you industries that have no treatment, so no refugees returned in those industries, versus industries that have one standard deviation of treatment. And what you see here is that after 1995, there is, the industries where treated are much more likely to have higher exports after the end of the period. This starts basically after, in the third and fourth period, so it takes a bit of time to kick in. Interestingly enough, and it's not unexpected, that part of the effect is not so much that the treated industries did much better, but that they did less bad, right? So there's a big dip first, and the treated industries suffer less from that dip, and that kind of makes sense in a country that just went through war. But it seems that these refugees are actually playing a role in rebuilding a lot of these industries. We have a bunch of results showing also like productivity measures, comparative advantage measures, not only plain exports. So if you're interested, you can see the paper. We have a bunch of results using UNIDO data only for Bosnia and for Serbia and specific countries, and it all really, the story, it's all goes together. The last thing I want to show you is who drives the results. Who are these refugees that are more important in driving more results? And to do that, what we did is to, we do have a lot of information of these workers. So we actually divide the workers in 6 different characteristics. Those that are skilled versus unskilled workers in terms of education, like college or secondary. I shouldn't use the word unskilled anymore. I try to call them fundamental workers, borrowing Michael Clement's terminology, which I think is much better. Then you have occupations intensive in manual tasks versus occupations intensive in analytical and cognitive tasks. Then you have low versus high skilled professions, like low skilled professions are drivers and carpenters. High skilled professions are engineers, lawyers, technicians, economists, accountants. Then you have then we also have workers who self-report as a manager versus those that don't. Then we have workers that work at the top 25% of paying firms in Germany versus those that work at the bottom 75%. Arguably, you can think that those firms at the top are more productive. And then we also have workers that actually their wage grows really fast while they were in Germany versus those that the wage doesn't grow as fast. Again, it could be a measure of productivity increases for the workers themselves. And our results are here. So we don't have a lot of good variation in all of them because, sometimes they're very noisy. But consistently, we, at least in terms of point estimates, we always find that the skilled workers, the workers in analytical tasks, the workers in high school professions, supervisors, etc., are the ones driving our results. And for half of them at least, we see strong statistical significance. So So again, this says like, this is consistent with the idea that these workers are really transferring somehow the technologies and the know-how and the knowledge back home, and that actually translates into higher productivity, higher exports in the case of this paper in particular. It's a big part of my research agenda. I have a bunch of papers looking at that. Last 2 minutes, I want to make sense of a couple of things that I think are important, because you might ask, well, what the hell? You have like maybe 20,000 workers in your sample, and then maybe some industries have like 10, 15, 2 people, and they are like really having such an impact on exports. Well, we're trying to push science, step by step, but I think that there's some interesting anecdotal evidence that we found very consistent. So Bill Easterly, in his book, of 2001, actually described the story of Desh, the big textile factory in Bangladesh. And it's based also in some research by the World Bank at the time. And they show that between 1980, I don't know if you know, but between 1980 and 86, the garment industry in Bangladesh rose from 0.5 to 30% of the export share of the whole country, of the whole export basket. And anecdotally, this is an anecdote, of course, but it is attributed to 130 Bangladeshi workers, only 4 of them were managers, who spent 8 months in 1979 training in Korea, right? So this anecdote like makes you think maybe a few people can actually play a huge role, and there is actually more and more evidence of that. Nick Bloom and his co-authors have found like interesting results on managers, on increasing export revenues for firms. These are huge effects. Michela Giorcella has amazing work showing that through the Marshall Plan, a lot of help was given to Italy, and just a few managers in different firms played a big role in increasing the productivity of those firms. So I think we are into something here that is consistent with the work of many. And just to conclude, we really think, based on this paper and other work I've been doing, that migrants are really an important driver of technology and knowledge diffusion. And this is an idea that is at the core of the gains from migration. If productivity explains the vast majority of cross-country income differences, and know-how and technology can explain a huge increase in productivity, so then maybe migrants are the key of economic development, and that's a lot of what I devote my time to. And in this paper, we're really trying to get to that, providing a neat natural experiment. And the policy implications are many, but the most trivial one, just to keep it short, is like the importance of integration of refugees in the host country's labor market, because they can really play a huge role in the post-conflict reconstruction of their home countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Dany. That was wonderful. I think maybe one initial question is I'm wondering if you can help us think a little bit about the generalizability of these findings. So do we expect things like this to only be salient in patterns like this to only be salient in middle or high income countries where there might be sufficient educational opportunities at home, or alternatively high skilled labor for refugees in their hosting country? How should we be thinking about that?
Well, Appendix I or J, one of those. Actually, we do that. We a little bit do the, there's a trade-off, because we want to get too much into the causal thing, so we can't say something at that level of rigorosity with rigor with the whole country. But we do the exercise, and we do find actually that using all the foreigners in the German labor force, and we don't have the exact thing of returning and the timing and so on, but we do find in this paper in particular that those results hold, that there is a correlation between the number of workers working in each sector in Germany and the performance of those sectors at home. So that's a bit of what we do in terms of external validity. Again, it was kind of section 1 of the paper, then became section 2, and now it's Appendix H. But lastly, we do have other work on that, right? So I do have a paper with Helen Rappaport in the EJ in 2018 that also looks at cross-country variation. Actually looks at when French people moved to South Africa that's actually a thing in the late 1700s. Maybe they were part of what explains the huge and very renowned and delicious wine industry in South Africa nowadays. So that's very much part of my research, and we do have evidence that it's a wider phenomenon.
Great, that's very well taken, and looking forward to hearing more about the expansion of that research agenda. Being mindful of time, I'm going to move on to Isabel, despite the fact that there are a couple of questions for you, Dany, in the chat, so I'll leave those to you. Isabel Ruiz is a fellow in economics at the University of Oxford, and she will similarly be helping us think through what happens when refugees do return home. So, Isabel, over to you. We can't hear you, unfortunately. But we can see your screen.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, let me see if I can get this going. And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm not sure what's going on with my camera, but I guess I'll start this way. Thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation to present. Today I will be presenting a work with Carlos Vargas Silva, who's also here at the University of Oxford, and this is on refugee return and social cohesion. Just to give you an idea of these papers, we've been working on these for a while now. We collected data in Burundi in 2011, 2015, and this is kind of the last part of this project. I think this is probably going to be one of the last papers we provide with this data we collected. And it was we work on it, especially for the World Bank, on a project called Preventing Social Conflict and Promoting Social Cohesion in Forced Displacement Contexts. So we all know that that one of the preferred solutions to displacement for many refugees is to return home. We've been talking about that throughout the conference, and we know that for some of these refugees, return will occur eventually, even if decades have passed since they left their home communities, as we just saw in Dany's paper, and we can trace what has happened with them after many years having returned. We also know that some will be forced to return by their host countries. We just had a case presented in that sense. However, there's very scarce evidence to date on the impact of repatriation or return migration on social cohesion in communities of return. There is, for example, a recent World Bank review on the evidence of social cohesion and forced displacement that points that issues of return and repatriation are largely invisible in the literature, and that this absence weakens a programmatic ability to devise inclusive intervention in return areas. So we think this is an important topic, trying to understand what happens after refugees return. So what we do in this paper is we're going to explore the impact of repatriation on social cohesion in communities of return, and we're going to be focusing on Burundi for the empirical analysis. We're also going to explore how these effects differ across different subsamples based on ethnic composition, pre-war land scarcity, and attitudes towards refugees. In here, the important aspect is to think whether those who stayed, those that did not leave the country, and those that returned perceive each other in a way that would reduce social cohesion. So trying to think about this aspect of social cohesion, what we did was to try to build up a conceptual motivation. And we looked into 4 different types of literatures: the literature on out-group and in-group cooperation after conflict, on displacement, return, and identity formation, community heterogeneity, and competition for scarce resources. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we conceptualized this study and the hypothesis that we had prior going into the empirical analysis. And we know that in this literature of out-group and in-group cooperation, there's been some evidence that exposure to violence and conflict leads to more pro-social behavior. And this has been in a myriad of activities, from behaving more altruistically, including in lab games, to higher likelihoods of joining social groups. However, that increase in pro-social behavior tends to be towards one's own identity group members. Right? So conflict reinforces societal divisions between groups. In other words, less cooperation with our group members. So we posit that the process of displacement and return can create divergent identities between returnees and stays, especially after a long time has passed, right? Returnees, for example, share the common experience of escaping conflict, adapting to life abroad, sometimes even growing up abroad, sometimes having even been born abroad, and then returning home, with many being forced to return. On the other hand, stays can have different perceptions of patriotism, nationhood, and deservedness of limited community resources, given their role of having stayed and having had to protect these resources during the conflict. And in fact, Stephanie Schwartz has done a beautiful ethnographic work, specifically in the case of Burundi, where she provides evidence that of group identification based on the location during war. Less repatriés and less residents. I don't speak French, so excuse my pronunciation. But she provides evidence that there's been this difference between the returnees and the stays. With the stays even calling the returnees the Tanzanians, because that's where I'm going to show you that's where most refugees went. And I just wanted to read you this quote from Stephanie's paper, where she says that migration-related divisions not only cut across ethnicity, but frequently divided families where members had lived on either side of the border during war. As such, migration-related categorizations existed independent of, although sometimes associated with, ethnic categorization. So that led to our first two hypotheses. So returnees are likely to be seen as an out-group members by stays and vice versa. Therefore, repatriation may have a negative impact on social cohesion. And our second hypothesis was that the effect of repatriation on social cohesion would be more negative or less positive in communities with stronger signs of migration-related divisions. We also looked into the literature on community homogeneity, and we know that the level of diversity of the receiving community in terms of key markers of identity also plays a role. There's a large literature on these, on the implications of multiculturalism, but one of the things that comes out in this specific literature is that individuals often react negatively to threats to homogeneity, at least in the short term, right? So when there's a lot of homogeneity, difference doesn't sit very well, at least in the sort of in a short period of time. So in communities that are more homogeneous in relation to other key markers of identity, the arrival of returnees with clearly different identity can have more adverse effects on social cohesion. So that led to our third hypothesis when we were trying to come up with a conceptual framework that the effect of repatriation on social cohesion should be more negative or less positive in communities with less diversity related to other factors. So obviously economic factors also play a role, and the impact of repatriation is not only confined to identity issues, right? There could be broader economic concerns. Refugee return could also reduce social cohesion because of additional competition for resources, especially when resources are scarce, and in the case of Burundi, this even more so. And this effect should be greater for those resources in which scarcity cannot be solved in the short term. And particularly here, we're talking about land. And this will play a role in our empirical analysis, as I will show in a minute. But this led to our last hypothesis, in which we pose that the effect of repatriation on social cohesion should be more negative or less positive in communities in which resources are scarcer. So some of you might be familiar, but some of you might not. So I'll give you a little bit of the context. Burundi underwent a conflict during 1993 and 2005, where 5% of the population was killed and about 10% was international displaced. Around then, the population was 5.5 million residents. So what's particularly interesting about this displacement is that most displacement occurred by foot. So people walked, and most refugees ended up going to Tanzania, which was the regional safe haven. So over 90% of the refugees during the civil conflict went to Tanzania. And eventually Tanzania pushed them out, right? They eventually closed the refugee camps. They ended up protections and services, and refugees had to return. There was a large return. Over 500,000 refugees returned in the period of a few years. What was key about this context is also that returnees were able to reclaim land in their communities of origin. And remember that this is a scarce resource in this country, but the recovery of the promised agricultural land was very problematic, right? Having to go back to your own community and trying to show that this was your own land and so on. Just to show you sort of a bit of some data, this is the number of the Burundian refugees in Tanzania. You can see that there's, before 1993, there's already some refugees in Tanzania. This is from a 1972 conflict. Many of these refugees ended up staying in Tanzania and were granted citizenship. But then we see the large inflow after the 1993 conflict, and then we see the period of return. Now in 2015, there's a new wave of displacement from Burundi. As I mentioned before, we collected data in 2011 and 2015, but I'd like to point out that the data we collected in 2015 was before this new displacement started taking place. So what we do in this paper is we're going to use data from Burundi. We have household survey in which 15 households were interviewed in 100 communities across the 17 provinces of the country. We also have a community survey in which a local leader was interviewed in each of the 100 communities. And the number of communities selected in each province was based on the 2008 census. We excluded data for Bujumbura. We collected data, as I mentioned, 2011, 2015, but we will use the 2015 data for the analysis. This is just a map of Burundi again, and this is just to show you where we collected the data, where the places, the communities in which we collected the data. So how do we measure social cohesion? As we know, social cohesion is quite a complex concept. It's a multi-dimensional concept. So we try to approach the concept through different ways. One was, for example, thinking about support, measures of support. One example of a question was, how well do people in your community help each other these days? We also use conflict and reconciliations, questions related to that, like, in your opinion, is this community generally peaceful or marked by violence? We use measures of trust. We ask, please indicate the extent to which you trust the following people, groups, and institutions, and we gave them a list of different type of people and institutions. I will show you in a minute. And household member participation in specific organizations, right? We ask how many household members are active members of any of the following organizations, and we included a list of organizations that they could have membership with. So this just is an example of the different measures of social cohesion that we included, not only helping each other, but whether they could borrow money, whether they had reconciled with war, whether justice had been done, in terms of trust, whether they trust returnees, other ethnic groups, community leaders, and participation in different associations. So what we do is, with this data, we're going to run a regression where our dependent variable is going to be one of those indicators of social cohesion. We include a province indicator. R is the share of returnees in the community. We include household level controls and community level controls, but our estimate of interest is better, right? The one related to the share of returnees in the community. And we're going to, because when we were defining our sort of conceptual framework, we were also interested in different aspects of the communities and different subsamples. We divided our subsample by ethnicity. In Burundi, the Hutus are 85%, Tutsis are 14%, another 1%. but we define a community as less ethnically diverse if the majority groups accounted for 90% of the population. Just to give you an idea, about 45% of respondents live in less ethnically diverse communities. We use pre-land availability, and a community has more pre-war land availability if the community leader indicated that the pre-land availability was high and the quality was high, or very high. So there was those different options. And we also look at a subsample measuring attitudes towards return. In here, what we did is we added the forced responses to a return question. In the return question, we asked whether if people go abroad and comes back, whether they help the country, whether they fit in or bring new ideas and receive preferential treatment. So based on those 4 questions, we created sort of a variable where higher variable values indicated worse attitudes. And we divided these above and below the mean. So just for identification purposes, and in here, I'm just not going to spend too much time. You have the paper in there, but Tanzania mandated the return of all Burundian refugees from the 1993 conflict, and returnees also had very strong incentive to return to the communities of origin, as this was the place where they were entitled to land. I have 10 minutes, so I think I should be hopefully on time finishing these. Now, with our identification, there's a concern that communities with initially large levels of international displacement and more return later on could be inherently different from other communities, and that this might be driving the results, right? So what we do is we use an instrument for the share of returnees in the population, and we use a geographic instrument. We use proximity to Tanzania and flatness. In other words, altitude, but because of the way we define it, we called it flatness. So the idea here is that once we control for exposure, international displacement would depend on the accessibility of a safe haven. And displacement occurred, as I mentioned, by food. So distance to the border and altitude affected the level of international displacement from a given community. We ran traditional tests on instruments and used pre-conflict information, and we showed that proximity and flatness were not related to unobserved factors that affect variables related to social cohesion. So let me walk you through the results. When we look at the measures of support, what we found is that when we look at the variable of whether they help each other, there's a negative and significant coefficient. In other words, what we find in here is that a 10 percentage point increase in the population share of returnees in a community leads to a 10.3 percentage point reduction in the likelihood of stating that the community members mostly help each other. Now, the coefficient changes when we look at the different subgroups, right? So we see that the coefficient is substantially larger in communities with more negative attitudes towards return, which are less ethnically diverse, and which have less pre-land availability. So this supports our initial expectation regarding the communities in which the impact of refugee returns should be more negative. We also explore the impact of refugee return on the possibility of borrowing money for emergency from individuals outside the household. And we see again that there's a negative coefficient in our overall regression. We find that 10 percentage point increase in the population share of returnees decreases the possibility of borrowing, decreases the likelihood of stating that it is possible to borrow money by 8.4 percentage points. But in here, we see also different dynamics across subsamples of communities that are different in the previous variable. Now the coefficient is larger for more ethnically diverse communities and for communities with more positive attitudes towards return. This is obviously contrary to our original expectation, but it's still the case that the coefficient for communities with less pre-war land availability is larger for other communities. We also look at the impact of refugee return on violence and reconciliation measure. And again, what we find in here is that a 10 percentage point increase in the population share of refugees leads to a 5.6% reduction in the likelihood of perceiving the community as a peaceful one. And the coefficient is similar across more or less diverse communities, but the story changes if we divide communities on attitudes towards return. So in those communities where there's more negative attitudes towards return, the coefficient is larger and statistically significant. Now, for most of the other measures of trust, most of the coefficients are insignificant. There's some cases in which it's different that I'm not going to go into those for the for time. Sorry, this was on violence and reconciliation measures. So finally, we looked also at the impact of refugee return on trust measures, and we find different dynamics in here, right? Although we find that the main coefficients, none of them are statistically significant when we look at the first column, at all the at the whole sample. What we see is that they're, even if none are statistically significant, all are positive, and this contrasts with our previous results in which return had negative effects on different measures related to social cohesion, right? But there are some variations in here, which I won't go into discuss, but there are some different variations when we look at different subsamples. Finally, looking at the impact of refugee return on household participation in community activities, well, we see that overall the results suggest mixed dynamics regarding the impact of refugee return on participation of these communities. So refugee return leads to more participation, for example, in agricultural cooperatives in communities that are less ethnic, that has less ethnic diversity, and more pre-war land availability, and worse in those that have negative attitudes towards return. But also the coefficients that are statistically significant for the other three types of community participation are negative. So let me just follow up with the conclusions. Before I go into that, we conducted a couple of robustness tests. We limited the sample to stays only. And what we find in there is that slightly with larger coefficients, somewhat more significant, but main story remains the same. And changing our measure of returnee share of the population. So instead of relying from the household roster to the information, we've relied on the information of the community leader. And again, here the story remained the same. So let me summarize what we did in here. We know that repatriation involves the re-encounter of groups that were separated for many years and often decades, and this process could lead to the re-establishment of all societal divisions or the creation of new ones. And the results suggest varying impacts of refugee return on different aspects of social cohesion. Stronger effects suggest that refugee return has a negative impact on feeling that the community members help each other, could borrow money for emergency from non-household members, and felt that the community is peaceful. And the estimated impacts on measures of reconciliation, post-conflict justice, trust, participation in community groups are mostly statistically significant. However, the results from subsamples suggest that the negative effect on the feeling that community members help each other tends to be stronger in communities with worse attitudes towards refugee return. The negative effect of feeling that community members help each other tends to be stronger in communities with less ethnic diversity. And the negative effect of the feeling that community members help each other tends to be stronger in communities with less pre-land availability. So these are a lot of results, and putting them together in a whole story is quite difficult, but the results do suggest that there is not a single driver mechanism related to refugee return that can cover all aspects of a complex concept, such as social cohesion. However, the results do suggest that the process of out-migration and return could lead to new divisions in society based on the location of individuals. And here we're thinking about that separation between those the returnees and the stays. And these effects could be present in other countries or even supersede and get mixed with previous societal divisions. So thank you all for listening, and looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That was fascinating. I think I found that the takeaway that new divisions might form depending on where individuals are located during the conflict to be particularly interesting. And sort of that the results suggest that migration-related divisions might be more salient in communities with less ethnic diversity. That's fascinating to me. I think one question that I have for you is, given, as you say, return is often sort of the desired policy solution for refugee crises, but your work sort of presents this very complex set of effects on social cohesion, how should we be thinking about the policy implications of your work?
So, so there's different things, right? That we know that social cohesion is an area which is difficult to isolate single factors, and therefore shaping policy around them is quite challenging. However, it would be possible to identify the type of issues and the type of communities that need particular attention at the policy design stage, right? Trying to identify what are sort of, if there's problems with trust, if there's problems with sort of perception about those who return, and finding ways of, at the policy stage, at policy design stage, trying to sort of include them into these. You hear many cases of where the hosts get, where the returnees get upset because where the stayees get upset because the returnees are being helped a lot, coming back, which also happens in hosting societies anyways. But it's thinking about how to integrate both and thinking about those issues at the design stage. That obviously require understanding of the dynamics behind these new migration-related divisions, if there are, like trying to understand whether this is happening sort of at the return stage.
Great, thank you. A question from the chat from Dan. Could you clarify what negative attitude towards return means or how it was measured? I'm curious to hear about how, in this case, returnees select where to return to, example, which town, given that they return to the home country, especially in light of the subgroup analysis.
So so most returnees went back to their community of origin, and this was sort of the main incentive when the peace agreement took place. A big part of this was the promise of being able to get land, especially land at their sort of point of origin. So most returnees return to their community of origin. No, for attitudes towards return, we basically had 4 questions related to that. And let me read you the wording of the question. So we asked attitudes. We asked when people who have lived abroad come back, they help. One was help the country, do not fit in, bring new ideas, knowledge and technology, or receive preferential treatment. So basically we added the responses to that, where higher values would indicate worse attitudes, and divided the sample above and below the mean.
Great, thank you so much. Perhaps one final question, if I may. How should we be thinking about generalizability in this context? Sort of given the issues around land scarcity and the promise of land returning, or how there was sort of such a large influx of 500,000 people over a couple of years. How do we think about that?
So I was thinking about this, and obviously generalizability is quite difficult. Like one-to-one generalizability, it's very similar to the question you asked Dany as well, right? How can we generalize these results? However, there's many cases that could be similar, right? Like you can think about other refugee situations in which sort of there's been this protracted displacement, and then the return happens over time. You could think about sort of situations like not sure. So similar situations to what happened in Burundi.
Great. Thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you to all of the presenters. I feel like we could continue this conversation for a long time, and I think that the presentations were an interesting conversation with one another, and I wish we had more time to sort of delve into those connections and links there. But yes, thank you so much to all of the presenters today and to all of you for attending and also to the conference organizers. I hope to see many of you next year in person. I was really hoping we could be in Colombia together this year. I think I'm really armed with new ways of thinking about sort of practice and new framings of return from this session. I think Dan sort of had us think a little bit more about how the majority of returnees do intend to, or refugees rather, do intend to return home. Dany talked about how they could be important drivers of reconstruction, and I think Isabel sort of complicated this, asked us to be mindful of the potential negative impacts of return on sort of social cohesion. So I'm really grateful for the takeaways that I have from this panel, so thank you. Next in the program is a 15-minute break, after which we will have a keynote from Ted Miguel, Oxfam professor in environmental and resource economics at the University of California, Berkeley, who will be discussing new results from his panel survey of Syrian refugees in Jordan, the Syrian Refugee Life Study, a project actually that IPA was lucky enough to be able to support. So we'll see you back here at 1:15 US Eastern Time and 7:15 Central European Time. Thank you, everyone.